thanks to Joe, Carol, Mitch for the invitation. Robin Hunter's always a tough act to follow. Glad to be here to talk about what I think is a very important conversation. As you heard, it's an evolving conversation. And when we talk about access, sometimes we forget about the private payers. So I'll start quickly with a quick overview of Intercept. So Intercept Pharmaceuticals is a global company. We were founded 16 years ago, ironically enough, by a Canadian out of Toronto, Dr. Mark Brzezinski. Apropos of the previous conversation, it would have been nice to have had a stronger ecosystem cluster, and imagine Intercept having been born out of Canada. But nonetheless, we are based out of New York City. We have a worldwide footprint of 500 people, and we're about 2.5 years into our first launch around the world. So I quite like this image because I think sometimes when we talk about pharma in our industry, we talk in generalities, and these types of topics do beg for specificity. So when I think about market access, national pharmacare, it's hard to imagine having that discussion without looking towards the 23.2 million Canadians that have some form of third-party private insurance. And it's important to note that this is a very different environment than your public payer system. You're talking about, in the public payer space, a fixed envelope of funding for which you have to find a way to fund the most amount of people in your population. This is a very different environment. This is employee and employer contributions into total compensation. You're extracting a benefit from your private health insurance. And quite frankly, it's a competitive not-for-profit industry. So there are expectations that you would have by paying into that benefit. And those expectations are actually very clear. So I think as we're contemplating the scope of national pharmacare, how big, how small it is, we have to look at it through the lens of the fact that for 2 out of 3 Canadians, the expectations are actually set quite high in terms of what they want in terms of reimbursement. This is data that the Canadian Health Policy Institute had published about 3 or 4 months ago, looking at 479 different healthcare medications approved by Health Canada between 2008 and 17. And what they essentially found was that just over 400 medications are reimbursed by private insurers, less than 200 are insured by the public health system. So you're getting twice as many medications reimbursed on the private side of the market access mix, and quite frankly, they happen a lot quicker too. So in terms of speed of access, the average sort of time to get to about 80-90% of covered lives in the private insurance space is about 149 days, juxtaposed against 449 days on the public payer side of the mix. So what you're talking about is an environment here where people have twice as much access and 3 times as fast a path to getting reimbursement. So I think that's an important lens for us to consider in terms of the market access landscape and the role of pharmacare vis-a-vis private payers. This is additional research that sort of gives a sense in terms of how Canadians are thinking about national pharmacare. This is research that was done by Healthcare in Canada Institute. It's a consortium of a number of different stakeholders led by McGill. And essentially they asked 1,500 HCPs, healthcare administrators, even people in the lay public, what their expectations would be for a national pharmacare plan. And you get a number of different responses that come back, but essentially things tend to coalesce under two important pillars. One being that national pharmacare should essentially be a first payer, single payer system for all Canadians. And the second one being that national pharmacare should play the role of a gap filler behind private and provincial public access. So let's explore what happens then in terms of the private insurance environment that exists today. So under the first assumption, where the role of national pharmacare is essentially to be a gap filler to the current reimbursement landscape, you essentially go through your private payer access first. If you've exhausted that, then you fall into the existing provincial public health access mechanisms, and then ultimately national pharmacare fills that gap. Under that world, it's essentially status quo for the 23.2 million Canadians that have private payer access, and national pharmacare really is playing that role of safety net. Under the other scenario where national pharmacare is considered as a first payer choice for all Canadians, then potentially, and I use potentially with a capital P, private payers will play the role as sort of second payer of choice. But there are a number of different questions. I think as Carol had nicely outlined, the consultative process is done. We're waiting to sort of see the readout come spring. But in my mind, I think there's a number of sort of questions that remain to be answered. I think the first one is, what policy or legislative change do we expect to be introduced that might prevent somebody who has private payer access from accessing that if the national pharmacare program doesn't sort of meet their needs? Importantly, what's the role of somebody who's a cash-paying patient today? Will they still be able to sort of pick up product at point of sale for cash, or is that legislation going to inhibit that person from doing that? In terms of plan premiums, a number of large companies have ASO plans where essentially it's the pass-through cost of your drug plus an administrative fee, but for most companies, you have premiums, you have rated plans. How are these plan premiums going to readjust and evolve over the course of national pharmacare being introduced into the marketplace? We've talked a lot in the last week. It's had quite a number of headlines in the Globe and Mail about patient support programming, but what is the impact on patient support programs? We have a pretty convoluted, challenging path to navigating reimbursement. The average Canadian has a very difficult time understanding plan design, co-pays, how do I get my drug, where do I get drug in the era of specialty pharmacies, what will happen with these PSPs that play such a pivotal role in terms of underpinning patient health outcomes. Have we learned anything? I think of OHIP Plus for patients less than 25 as a bit of a canary in the coal mine. What are the key learns that we've learned from the OHIP Plus experiment, and how do those play out in terms of constructing a logical, pragmatic path forward for national pharmacare in Canada? And last but certainly not least, what is the impact on patient health outcomes? So I remember in a previous world, somebody had said to me, sometimes drugs fail patients, and sometimes patients fail drugs. And more recently, I feel very, very strongly that sometimes health systems can fail both. So even in a world where you have access, if you're not able to sort of go through the administrative hoops to get on that drug, stay on that drug, realize the health outcomes benefits, then all that is for naught. So I think a lot more questions than answers. I think we'll learn a lot more come April when the final report is published, but optimistic that 23.2 million Canadians that do have access today will continue to have great, broad, and fast access to our innovative therapies over time. So I thank you very much for your attention today.